Hey y'all, this is Dr. Know-It-All. This channel is dedicated to finding out whether I really do know it all or not. If you like this video, make sure you hit the thumbs up and subscribe for more of these. And definitely ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is in the description or at the end of the video. Without further ado, let's take a look at what the question of the day is. Drum roll, please. Okay. So this references right back here, that book there. The person says, so I see you've got the Apollo Guidance Computer book on your shelf. What were the 4 computers that took the Apollo mission to the moon and back in the 60s and 70s? So yeah, I think I can do you 2 better than that. I think I can give you 6 of these guys instead of just 4. So, okay, so to start with, the one that is in the book right there is the Apollo Guidance Computer, so that's number 1. I'm going to go through what they do in just a minute, but I'm just going to enumerate them first. The second one, which is basically the same thing as the Apollo Guidance Computer, is the Lunar Module Guidance Computer, or the LGC, sorry, which is on the Lunar Module, and was responsible, obviously, when they would undock and it would fly down to the surface of the moon. That computer would control the Lunar Module. There was also on board the Lunar Module an Abort AGS Abort Guidance System. I don't know why it wasn't computer, but anyway, that was like a super minimal computer that was used only in the case of if everything else failed, they could kind of push a button and kind of get back into orbit and so forth. So that was a fail-safe. And the, let's see, number 4 was the LVDC, or Launch Vehicle Digital Computer. So that would be the 4th one. That was actually not part of the Apollo spacecraft. That was part of the launch vehicle. Haha, surprise, because it's in the name. So the Saturn V actually had it, and it was at the top of the 3rd stage, kind of where the interstage was, where it went down to where the lunar module was. I've got another video on some of this stuff up here, so I'll link to it there. Okay, so what are my 2 better? I said I'd do you 2 better. There's one more computer that was on the actual Saturn V launch vehicle, and that was an analog computer that it was an analog integrator in a sense, and it would take the information from the LVDC, which could only operate, it was in the kilohertz range, so it was very, very slow. And so it could only do like a couple of operations per second. It could only give a couple of pieces of guidance per second. And so this other analog computer was much, much faster because it's not digital. It was an old school computer, kind of like the firing solutions on naval ships and things before digital computers took over. So basically it was programmed to take the information from the digital computer, translate that into how the engines had to gimbal and so forth to keep it straight. So that was much more quick. It was effectively real time, and the reason I call it an integrator was it kind of averaged out the information from the launch vehicle digital computer and put that into the engine information to make them operate correctly. So that's 5, okay? So there's only 4 digital computers on board, but there was a 5th. And then the 6th one, which was not really a computer, it wasn't on board, but it was super, super important, was the all of the NASA computers that they had on the ground. Because, and I'll explain the history of this just a little bit, but basically those computers were the ones that actually flew the Apollo missions most of the time. Not all of it, but most of the time. So let's rewind in history a little bit, right? We have to go back to the early 60s when all of this stuff was being set out. First of all, there is IBM that made the LVDC. There's IBM and many other companies that made the mainframe computers that NASA ran on. There was MIT and Raytheon, if I'm remembering. So MIT developed the AGC, the Apollo Guidance Computer, and the Lunar Module Guidance Computer. But Raytheon actually built it for them, so that was a company. And then the Abort Guidance System, TRW? I think TRW. So anyway, so TRW made that. So if you think about this, this was a very heterogeneous thing. There were 4 digital computers on board made by actually 4 different companies. So MIT plus IBM plus Raytheon plus TRW, if I'm remembering correctly. So that was 4 different computers that were manufacturing the different computing power for the ships, which is a little scary. But in addition, NASA had a ton of different vendors that supplied the computing power for all of their on-the-ground computational power. So, people talk about like, hey, the AGC was amazing. It was this compact thing. It was only, I think, 35 or 40 kilos, so like 80 pounds, something like that. And it was in a box, and it wasn't that big. And it was an amazing thing. And the LVDC was also an amazing thing. The LVDC actually flew the Saturn V, so I give it complete credit, right? There was no way that there was going to be real-time telemetry coming up from the ground and giving information to the LVDC in time for it to correct anything. So IBM, kudos to them. They developed this thing. It worked. There was no problem with it, and it flew the rockets, no problem. So that one did work on its own. But the AGC required input from the ground to basically keep it on track. The AGC was almost a backup computer in a way. So if what happened was MIT originally said that they could develop this thing, and the goal was for it to autonomously fly the Apollo spacecraft to the moon, land, come back, and it was all going to be taken care of autonomously. But the schedule kept getting slipped and slipped and slipped, and as it got closer and closer to 1967, when they were planning on starting to launch these vehicles, NASA and, IBM was pissed about the whole thing because they wanted to develop the computer in the first place, so they were not happy about that. But anyway, and so they may have had some influence on this, but basically NASA kind of backed out and said, oh man, we don't trust that MIT and Raytheon are going to be able to develop this thing in time to get it to work properly and be completely autonomous. So what we're going to do is rejigger the protocols so that as the ship is flying, right, there will be telemetry that will come in from ground-based stations, from the actual vehicle itself. That will be collated. Calculations will be done on the ground, and the supercomputers will come up with an answer, and they will then send that information to the Apollo astronauts, who will then be responsible for putting the information into the AGC so that it knows what's going on. So it was flying the ship, but it was flying it kind of as a secondary to the ground-based systems. A couple of exceptions for that. Number one was when the Apollo went behind the moon, there's no signal with the Earth, right? Because the moon is this giant shield that's blocking it. So therefore, during that period of time where there was a critical burn that happened both to put them into lunar orbit and also to take them out of lunar orbit, the AGC was flying completely on its own. It was its own thing. But, that was a relatively brief period of time when it was doing that. And then the other super critical part was that the LGC, the Lunar Module Guidance Computer, that had to fly down on its own completely without any back and forth with the ground. The reason for that, of course, was that there's a several second delay between communication between the moon and the Earth because of light travel time. And then, of course, if you added in computation time, if a computer had to figure something out and then send back an answer, there was no time for that. So the lunar module was on its own. It had to do this on its own. So all of that guidance was completely internal. The AGC and the Lunar Module Guidance Computer were both very, very similar. Essentially, it was the same hardware. It was just the software was different. And of course, if you don't remember, the software is this crazy rope memory thing where they literally had women who were like, who worked in looms normally in fabric. They actually stitched the memory into these things. Crazy, crazy stuff. But anyway, that rope memory was different between the Lunar Module and the Apollo. And then, of course, there was the Abort Guidance System, which was a whole separate computer. Again, it was a complete failsafe. It was like you're on the lunar module, something goes wrong, you're on the surface, the computer just decides to crap out, and that's the end of it. You can put in the information, and there's this very, very basic computational system that's completely independent of the other one that will get you back up to the Apollo and allow you to dock with it and get back home again. One interesting thing about the Abort Guidance System is that it uses very little power. So I believe Scott Manley recently, I'm going to put a link to this up here, but he did an episode on YouTube about how I believe Apollo 13 actually used the Abort Guidance System more than the AGC while they were on the lunar module trying to get home again. And the reason for that was that the AGS was much more low power, and so they could actually run it on the batteries that they had because the lunar module was only designed to support 2 people for like a couple of days on the surface, it only had batteries. It didn't have fuel cells. It didn't have all this extra power like the Apollo did. So they were not able to utilize the full amount of power that they would be able to use under normal circumstances. They had to conserve power. So anyway, they used the AGS. To the best of my knowledge, that is correct. That's what happened. Okay, so anyway, that's how all of the different computers work together. So the ground-based computers basically told the Apollo guidance system what to do under normal flying circumstances on the 3 days to the moon and the 3 days back. But while they were on the far side of the moon and while they were landing and taking off from the moon and so forth, that was completely autonomous, and the AGC ran it. The LVDC, or Launch Vehicle Control, or Launch Vehicle Digital Computer, was completely responsible for getting the rocket ship from the ground all the way up into orbit, and then actually to insert it into the lunar orbit before it disconnected. The third stage disconnected, and the lunar module was extracted, and then the third stage was sent on, either to crash into the moon or to go into orbit around the sun. That's another interesting story, is that the third stage of many of the Apollo missions was actually sent to crash into the moon, which is kind of fascinating. So yeah, there you go. That's how they were all used. So there was actually a bonus. There were actually 6 computers that were used to get mankind to the moon and back again. Okay, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more of this. And definitely please ask questions either in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.